minutes, but you're what?
No, I'm gonna get lost. Remember when I'm like, we have to make this go edit right now? I thought that was like neurotic. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. They go together.
Started. Joni. Thanks, Joni, for doing all your rounds.
Wait, I found one.
Okay. All right. All right, welcome. Good afternoon. Nice to see everybody. We have a sick commissioner, so we're sending our best, but he is not up for the meeting. So we will proceed and fill him in accordingly. I wanted to open by talking for a few minutes to provide an update on the search for the new commissioner. As we all heard last month and talked about at our March meeting, we have Tom Weber in the role until June 30th. So I thought that it would make sense. I've certainly sent a memo to all of you, but I just wanted to take a moment at the public meeting to just reiterate the process. To manage the process at the outset, I have formed a preliminary screening committee, which is composed of, that I will chair with Sheila Balboni, Carolyn Kane, Jim Pizer, the secretary, and Mary Wallachy. We are joined by 5 people from the field on that committee. Leslie Kinney from Suburban Child, who's done some work with Tally Foundation, Mary McGowan from the Mass Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, Mike Moriarty, a board member of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and somebody who is central to an early literacy initiative in Holyoke, Ann Nemitz-Carlson of the Child Care Centers of the Berkshires and a MADCA board member, and finally Mary Reed, who is the founder of the Bessie Tart Wilson Initiative for Children, has a long career in advocacy and in the field. This preliminary screening committee basically will undertake the initial stages of the search. We all have the posting, and we will ultimately all be the decision makers with finalists. But to go from here to finalists interviewing before the board, the preliminary screening committee is going to undertake that work. The position has been posted. It was posted last week. It will be up for 30 days, but we will start to look at CVs as they come in as a committee. We will get organized in terms of questions and what the candidate's sort of skills and competencies we're thinking about. I certainly want to be sure that all of us, that I have a chance to speak with all of you one-on-one outside of those who are on the committee. We are also conducting outreach with both the posting and to keep in touch with the field about what's needed. So various members of the screening committee are effectively serving as liaisons to other organizations to talk about the role of the next commissioner, what's needed, what's seen as a priority. I have also, in my role as chair of that committee, had a meeting with Commissioner Weber's deputy commissioners, had a meeting last week to just touch base and talk about the search and the position and the context of the work that's ahead for the new commissioner, and I will meet with them again in a few weeks and just plan to keep in touch. I think all of us on the screening committee, we met this morning, had our first in-person meeting to talk about the overall process, to talk about the context of the agency's work and the candidate criteria while we are in the process of sort of gathering CVs through the posting. I think all of us agreed we would welcome folks' thoughts, those from the field, those in the agency, other people. If we're hearing about folks who are interested, to certainly direct them to us and/or to Jennifer Flagg in the Executive Office of Education, who is sort of staffing the search, if you will. I think, ideally we would, in the course of May, certainly be interviewing what we think of as semi-finalists, with an eye towards putting a set of finalists 2 to 3 in front of this board when it makes sense. That could be the June meeting. It could be that we are in a position to call a special meeting of the board between the May and June meetings if we want to be sure we keep the pace up and seize the opportunity to keep moving. I think as the process unfolds, I'll certainly keep in touch, and we'll see where we're at in the coming weeks. We'll have a better sense. I mean, ultimately, we want a strong pool. We want to manage the time, and we don't want to rush something to simply get somebody in place. Mary, Sheila, Carolyn, anything else to add based on our meeting this morning and our work thus far?
Just that it was a good meeting, and we're excited about the work ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's a big job, and everyone's taking it very seriously.
Yeah. So I will questions or comments from others on the board. I'm going to, had some outreach myself to Bill Eddy through MADCA. We just want to keep making sure that we're staying in touch with key stakeholders in this process too. Peter Dolliver from YMCA, others. Yeah.
So, Noni, you and I have had some conversations about this. I guess I'm absolutely thrilled, and I respect everybody who's on the board. My concern is that the entire board didn't have input, particularly into the job description. And I wish, even though we're working on a timeline
right.
faster than light,
yeah.
I wish we had.
Yeah. Right. We did discuss that when we spoke by phone. I appreciate that perspective. Absolutely. Yeah. Trying to balance, we can't do work through the open meeting laws, right? We can't work as a board offline, and we're on a relatively tight time frame, but I appreciate that. It doesn't mean, however, that your perspective wouldn't come into the kinds of questions you may have of the finalists.
And you're saying that right now. So,
yeah.
Yeah. I get that.
Yeah.
Just the outset.
But I appreciate that. Mm-hmm.
I have a thought. Can you use the microphones?
I have a thought.
I want to hear it.
I think it's important to be transparent about the role of a diverse group looking into this decision from the very beginning. I look around us, we're not as diverse as we wish we were.
Right.
Yet it is still on the face of it, 4 white women, right? It's not a mixed group at all.
Right.
So just want to, perhaps there are other ways also I would think about family, family input and diversity, that we're transparent in how that has a role from the very beginning of this process. And maybe it does, and we just don't exactly know.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly in thinking through the screening committee, there's that piece in discussion and outreach to the field, absolutely. It's true that we are rather limited on this board at this time. Yeah, no, it's definitely worth noting. Uh-huh.
Noni, the only other item I just want to share is that the job posting is up on the state website, but to the extent that the board and anyone else wants to share that far and wide, the key is to get the best pool of candidates in that we possibly can. And the only way we do that is to make sure that we're reaching everybody anyone can think of who would be interested and qualified for the position. So
yeah, absolutely. And thanks to those of you who already done that. I know that Joan in particular took a lot of time to get it out through her channels and national, et cetera, but I couldn't agree with you more. I think as I said in that initial communication, there's the recruiting and there's the input, and they're equally important. Any last comments on the search? Okay, so we'll simply keep in touch on that point. Undersecretary does not have comments. Commissioner is not here for comment. Amy O'Leary from Strategies for Children is here to make public comment.
Sure you don't have anything to say? Good luck this morning. Thanks, Joni. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me here today. We know that there have been recent exciting developments for young children and family in Massachusetts. We were thrilled to hear about the Massachusetts winning the federal preschool development grant Birth Through 5, $1.8 million, which will be managed by EOE and in partnership with the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. We are thrilled to hear that and glad that Massachusetts is a winner of that. We know the FY19 budget passed in June had $5 million for the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. The RFR was released in late November. We came to the board meeting in November to testify to make sure that that happened as soon as possible. So thank you for getting the RFR out. And we know that 12 communities applied for the funds, and in January, 6 were granted, including New Bedford, Somerville, North Adams, Springfield, Lowell, and Boston. So it's going to support the preschool expansion from February through June. And we know that this funding built on 3 years of state funding to help local communities, 18 of them that have developed comprehensive plans since 2016. And we know that that funding was built upon the federally funded 4-year preschool expansion grant that we won in 2015 that has been used to implement high-quality preschool for 4-year-olds in 48 classrooms that are full day, full year in 5 communities. And we know that that grant helped us learn lessons in communities that can help inform future policy making and funding opportunities. And we are eager today to hear more about those, the PEG evaluation and the CPPI new acronym update. But we know there also have been some challenges. The original grant ends in August of 2019. And in his current FY20 budget, the governor funded the CPPI line item at $2.5 million. And that while that will maintain the current grantees for CPPI, it will not help expansion or filling in the funding that will end, the $15 million that will end in August. And we will see tomorrow what the House proposes in their budget. Our intern, Casey Peaks, who is a Zantz Fellow, followed up with many of the communities who were awarded funding and heard some of the themes that are highlighted around the timing. So the timing was especially difficult given the districts were on holiday break right before the application was due, and given the collaborative nature of the grant, the timing was not conducive to fostering strong partnerships between the providers in the district. And not only was the due date unreasonable, but the turnaround between the funding date and first implementation deadline was unreasonable. There was no way that we could meet the implementation deadline if we started working on the plan. Goes on to say we had to kind of do it just in case so we were ready for the funding if needed. And as we have worked more closely with communities to develop an understanding of their local landscape, we keep running into this data challenge as we try to answer the following questions. How many children are there in a community? By age? What's the current licensed capacity to serve children birth through 5? How many children are on the wait list for a subsidy? How many early educators will it take to fully fund staff classrooms? How many public classrooms are there? And what child care arrangements do families want and need for children birth through 5? So while some of this data exists, it is in many different places and not always accurate and from many different sources. Communities are doing the best that they can to piece it together, but they shouldn't have to. We need strong partners and systems between the state and local communities to have accurate data and information so we can effectively use the current resources and better understand what's needed. We also need this information and data to be more publicly available and systematically updated on EEC's website with stakeholders at regular intervals. Since 89% of the funding for early education and care is from the federal government or a state match to get that federal funding, it would be helpful to see the breakdown of how that all plays out through the line items. Like many other advocates, we have asked to see the required plan to spend the additional Child Care Development Block Grant funding from the federal government. As advocates, we want to have the most accurate and up-to-date information. We ask you for partnership and are happy to further discuss opportunities to work together around this. Also around the search for the new commissioner, any help that we can give, we'd be happy to do so. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. So that concludes our public comment. We'll move now to the minutes from the March 12th meeting in Worcester. I did not have any amendments, corrections. Others? Lots of public comment, which was great. That's always great about going off-site. Any comments or amendments? All right, all in favor? Oh, go ahead, Mary.
I don't think I was present.
Only you would know that, in total honesty.
I want to make that correction. I believe I was not.
You're right, you were in Denver. I now remember. All right. It's good that you've got a handle on that. All right, all in favor with the amendment that Mary Wallachie was not there? All approve? Great. Okay, minutes. Thank you. Board committee updates. I mentioned in my memo, in conjunction with the search, I do want to really thank Joan Wasser-Gish for stepping into the role of co-chair of the Workforce Development Committee with Eleonora while I redeploy my efforts towards the search. So I will turn it over to Eleonora for an update.
Hi, everybody. We had a fabulous meeting on April 4th. Joan was present on the phone, so please feel free to add anything that I may be missing. But we had a very interesting meeting where we pay attention in particular to two aspects of the work that the committee is doing. One was that we spent some time looking at the career pathway, and we got an update of how the department, the agency is thinking about the career pathway, and we have now even a graphic representation of the career pathway, which is extremely helpful. We're going to move in the direction of giving points for very different characteristics that the members of the workforce will bring with them. We want to assure everybody that we're going to be grandfathering in everybody who is in the workforce right now, so these will be applying only to people who enter the field as new members. But one of the things that is innovative about this is we're going to continue with the same roles of assistant teacher, teacher, lead teacher, but we're going to create a new category that is mentor teacher. And the mentor teacher would follow the lead teacher position, and from the mentor teacher, you can go to a director. You can also enter the directorship after being in the lead teacher. And at the moment, the proposal is that the mentor teacher could have the role of coach or of training. And all of these has very specific requirements that have to do with degree obtained, learning points, competency points, and experience points that will be given, and then some flexible points where people will be able to decide on their own what they want to do to bring up their in a way, their status within the career pathway that we will have. So all of this was presented as a proposal. We had a very productive discussion about what it would mean and how it could work out. There are still a few details to work out, but it's moving in the direction that we have been talking about for some time. Then we connected that to the discussion about the core competencies, core knowledge and competencies, and the alignment between that and the QRIS. And we're thinking about the core knowledge competencies as the individual requirements and the QRIS as the program requirements. And the agency has been paying very close attention to how do we align those two pieces so that it's very clear that what we are expecting in the workforce will be reflected in how we, in a way, measure QRIS for the different programs. And then the rest of the conversation and the meeting we spent looking at QRIS and where we are with the revisions of the QRIS, the infrastructure that we will need in how professional development will figure out and will be part of the criteria that we'll be using for the QRIS, and then looking and having a conversation about curriculum and how are we going to be thinking about the curriculum that we expect in early childhood education programs, because one of the things that we have been talking about for quite some time is about should we as an agency have a particular set of curriculum criteria that we use, should we have a curriculum that we propose, should we be in the role of revising or reviewing curriculum that agencies present to us. So we had a conversation about different options. We haven't come to any conclusion, but we certainly discussed what it would mean important for us and for the QRIS in particular to be looking at curriculum and the rubric that we would be creating for the center, the programs to evaluate the curriculum that they use and the role that it would play in their own advancing in the QRIS. So the very, very last moment of the conversation was about the Workforce Council membership, and I think that we're going to have a discussion here. So I defer to that conversation later on. Joan, anything that I'm missing?
There's a great summary. The only two things that I will add are that we're really seeing the agency, I think, draw upon a lot of the prior work that's been done, both within the agency relative to curriculum frameworks and standards, as well as looking to models at DESE and also elsewhere across the nation to inform the work that's underway. The other piece for everyone to be aware of is that, as Eleonora described, we're bringing the program quality and workforce components closer and closer together. As part of that, there are real implications for how other strands of agency work need to align in terms of timing. So, for example, if we're asking programs to essentially build a program-level infrastructure to enable more professional development within the context of the job, that has a cost associated with it, and it makes real urgency around shifting to a tiered rate system, which is something that's been under discussion for a very long period of time. There are also IT implications, and so as we think about workforce, we also need to think about how to strategically align different facets of work that are underway across the agency to bring these are the right ideas, it's the right work, but to actually make it operational, we have to be closely attuned to how all these pieces of the puzzle are working. But it was a good discussion, and thank you to the staff for doing a great job.
Yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to say, that I am amazed every time that we finish the meeting, the amount of work that goes into every month when we meet, the amount of work that they present to us. Clearly the agency is working extremely hard, and we truly appreciate the work that everybody's doing. They always laugh when I mention that, but I always said, like, I don't know how you're making so much progress so quickly. And it is amazing because it requires, as Joan says, a lot of the alignment and coordination between the different works groups of the agency. So it has been really impressive. So thank you so much.
Sheila.
Well, this information is very exciting and wonderful. I love the idea of the new position, the mentor teacher, because I really see that as helping the whole program be sustainable as we move forward. Will that be available to the public and to the field?
I think that we still need to have a more discussion and more agreement before it is presented, yeah. But we are moving in that direction.
Sooner rather than later. That'll be helpful too. Thank you. And curriculum is very important to the field too. I think, you know, some of this without curriculum is going to be challenging. So thank you for seeing that as an urgent action item as well.
So let me echo Sheila's piece on the curriculum. Thank you. And I am sorry I wasn't able to participate in that meeting. But I think there is so much good work, and I'm thrilled to hear about the alignment and the bringing, as you say, Joan, the system together so that we're not in disparate piles. I think it's fabulous. And I'd love to explore the idea of a rubric with criteria of what do we look at for a comprehensive high-quality curriculum rather than recommend a boxed curriculum in a sense. I sit on the board with my hat of public school. That's why I'm here. And I can't help but see that as Eleonora, we were talking about who this is for. I don't hear public school teachers, I don't hear principals, and I understand that the licensing is different in a sense, but I still wish that the system could address the mixed delivery system and the continuum of services. Could a mentor teacher be a tenured teacher in the public school? Could he or she have the competencies of special education that other folks might need, or of diversity of language acquisition? Could a principal kind of carry that mantle as well, so that we can look at this as a true mixed delivery system, even though the resources might not get there. We have resources, and could they be shared?
Johnny, I think that at this moment, we have been concentrated on center-based to begin with an acknowledgement that there are many other areas that we need to pay attention to, but we need to begin somewhere. So we're not trying to do everything all at once. We're trying to really sort of focus on something. And right now, what I describe is related to center-based only, but it is good feedback that we need to remind ourselves all the time that we really need to look at the mixed delivery system, definitely.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mary, just a quick comment, because I know we need to move on, and just something to think about. I happen to, wearing my funder hat, not my board hat, this morning, go to a meeting with New Profit, and Secretary Pizer was there talking about the new initiative that we're going to be undertaking as a department with New Profit, with the identification of the early childhood support organizations. And clearly, as a part of that, there's discussions around curriculum and mentoring and coaching, and I guess I just want to say I hope that your committee will sort of think about when that is here, which is soon, how does that align with the work that you guys are doing? So that's basically.
And with regard to that, I think that initiative always raises some concern in my mind about sustainability. Is there's a way to integrate some aspects of this system so that, you know, we don't rely on an outside agency to do something that should be done inherently within the system in order to be effective and long-term.
So that was a big discussion in March at our March meeting, right? Where we no. I'm glad you raised it, and I think we did land on the need to be able to articulate and implement that initiative as a systems building initiative, not simply as dropping models in, but what is it that the state can learn and build capacity, you know, and have some intel into scalability through that initiative. In other words, we don't really want to know if the 6 models work. We want to know if we can, through those models, for example, articulate a model of coaching that's manageable and feasible at the state level, just as an example. So I think I wasn't participating in April, but in March, that was certainly a key piece of the conversation about the ECSO model.
I would just add, not only what can the state learn, but what can, you know, the field learn on the ground.
That's right, about how to do this work on the ground and not simply have packaged, exactly, to your point, yeah.
The only thing I want to add in response to Mary's comment is that the agency has put forward, or will be putting forward, RFRs that are really complementary. One that pertains to the ECSOs and another that pertains to technical assistance and professional development. And the vision is that these things will work in alignment and in compatible fashion to serve different facets of the field. So there definitely is a sort of systems view on that. At the same time, though, there are some very real risks that are imposed and that we have to be really cognizant of, particularly within a limited marketplace for coaches, and particularly where we're looking at how to really ensure that there is infrastructure to support program quality that is suitable to the very diverse mixed delivery system. It's going to look different for different types of programs, and how do we ensure that there is, in fact, sustainable infrastructure and not one that is very, sort of too temporary to sustain program quality over time. And that's part of what we're working to balance.
Great. Well, thank you, Eleonora, Joan, and others. Turn now to Dave on fiscal. I guess hot off the press this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. The Fiscal and Oversight Committee met this morning. We really had 2 items on our agenda. We continue to, get an update every month on the caseload from Carol Meehan, who does a really fine job of keeping track of all the data. And just to share with you, the committee feels comfortable with our slot utilization, our wait lists, and where we're headed in that direction. But we also had a presentation this morning, which I want to talk to the board for a few minutes about. It was a presentation by Michelle Smith and Kathy Kelly on grants administration. And I think we're familiar with a lot of the large grants that the department has, but I found this morning's meeting talking about some of the smaller grants, some of the grants that are really on the ground throughout the Commonwealth. to be of significant interest and significant value. And as I listened to them not only describe the grants, but also to talk a little bit about who is being awarded the grants, the amount of money involved, I understand that managing these grants is, whether it's a $10,000 grant or $1 million grant, is very time-consuming and involves a significant amount of focus on the part of all the staff. But I also want to recommend, Madam Chairperson, also I'd like to recommend that this particular slide deck that was presented, be shared with the entire board. I think there's some really valuable information in there that would give everybody a really clear overview of the breadth and scope of the department's work, not only in FY19, but in particular of what they're looking to do in FY20. So it was a great meeting, a good meeting, and I, again, would like to recommend that Kathy and Michelle's presentation be shared with the rest of the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions or comments for Dave around fiscal? Definitely noted on ensuring that everybody gets that deck. Thank you, Dave. All right, we'll turn now to our main agenda items, starting with the Preschool Expansion Grant and the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. Welcome to Jocelyn Bond, Sarah Volkanen, Amy Checkaway, and Barbara Goodson from ABT. Sarah and Jocelyn from the agency. Thank you.
Thank you. We are very pleased to be here. I have to be right up to my mouth. Oh, I have control of the slides too. We are pleased to be here to speak about, to provide a summary of the findings from 4 years of the Preschool Expansion Grant evaluation, and also give an update on where things stand with the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. So I will stop there for now and turn it over to Barbara Goodson and Amy Checkaway from ABT to provide the discussion on the preschool evaluation, and then Sarah and I will pick up with the CPPI grant.
All right. Thank you for having us here today. I'm Amy. Barbara, I think most of you know us. I actually realized we were here exactly a year ago to present on the impact study findings, and so now feels like an appropriate time to provide an update to all of you, especially on some of the findings that we have been making sense of in the course of the past year, as well as discuss some sort of lessons learned over the course of the 4 years of the PEG evaluation. So we're going to focus today on a few things. One, just doing a quick recap of the PEG model as a reminder, but we're not going to spend much time on that since we've talked about it in the past. Second, just quickly revisiting the PEG impact findings, but really focusing today on some additional information about family outcomes, about implementation findings over time, as well as some data we've had the opportunity to gather on non-PEG classrooms within the same agencies that are overseeing the PEG classrooms as a point of comparison. And then we'll sort of share some of our overall summary points and pass it to EEC staff about some of their takeaways and future plans. So, as a reminder, Massachusetts was awarded a federal preschool expansion grant in late 2014, and funds were really focused on expanding full-day, full-year preschool to 4-year-olds through a public-private partnership model. In Massachusetts, PEG focused in 5 communities: Boston, Lowell, Lawrence, Springfield, and Holyoke, and involved collaboration between each of the local school districts who subcontracted to and partnered with local community-based organizations. At least one of the organizations in each community was a Head Start agency, and then there were 1 or more non-sort of Head Start-focused community-based agencies. The collaborative structure at the local level really was central to the Massachusetts model, and I think Massachusetts had a sort of unique vision in terms of this really being a shared governance structure and an opportunity, although the services and classrooms were housed within the community-based organizations, to bring together everybody who was participating, including the public school representation, to strategize and plan for the supports that were necessary to offer teachers, and were really a focus of this grant, as well as being a support structure for directors, and also to strategize about how to best serve families and provide comprehensive services. The requirements for children and families to participate in PEG were in part required by the federal grant in terms of the income eligibility, which, as you may recall, is that families must have an income of below 200% of the federal poverty level. And in fact, PEG families, the majority of PEG families were well below 100% of the federal poverty level in terms of who's actually served. All kids had to be eligible for kindergarten in the following year and reside within the local school district boundaries in each of the communities. Massachusetts really had a particular focus on trying to serve some of the most vulnerable families, and there was a strong prioritization for children with no prior formal early childhood experience, and in fact the majority of kids served had no prior preschool experience. A lot of resources were spent on doing outreach to families within the community to try to get the word out about this program and sort of recruit them to participate. I just also wanted to note that almost half of the kids who participated in PEG each year, and it was about 800 kids per year in each of these cohorts, did not have English as a primary language, and about 6% of the kids served had IEPs or special education formal plans. In terms of the focus of the grant, again, there was a real focus on the shared management structure and collaboration within the communities in terms of all of the planning, and also making sense of sort of how implementation was going, strategizing about how to make improvements. And one of the focuses of this evaluation has been to provide back data to communities to sort of in customized reports at the community level and at each of the agency levels, and to share back multiple times per year the information we're gathering, particularly the classroom observation data, which we've had the capacity to collect every year, and child assessment data, as well as survey data. And so the EC staff have also played a strong role in really helping to facilitate the conversations about the use of data, and have observed that I think is useful in terms of shaping how to make improvements on a year-to-year basis. I think, I'm not going to go through each of these quality components, but there were structural requirements and a strong focus, again, on providing professional development supports to the educators in the PEG classrooms, not only the lead teachers, but also the assistant teachers and support staff, as well as, again, trying to really work to engage families and provide them with the supports needed. As you may recall, although there were particular expectations that the state set, there was also an allowance or a sort of a good amount of flexibility that communities and even agencies within communities were given in terms of how to implement some of the specifics. For example, there was not a standard curricula, and sometimes there were different curricula used even within the same agencies and PEG classrooms. So I'm going to pass it to Barbara now to talk about.
I'm
oh
sorry,
yeah.
Amy. I blanked for a minute.
Yeah.
Different curricula across the programs, or same, or mixed?
Within communities.
What did you? Different.
Yes, there was variation both within community, across community, and programs or agencies were able to make decisions as well as particular sites. That's correct.
For looking at outcomes.
It's actually an interesting question, Jocelyn, that we might want, like how they choose a curriculum, because there was a lot of variation across these. It wasn't that everybody thought, oh, there's one good curriculum. And I don't think I've spent a lot of time asking or asking the programs, what goes through your mind when you pick a curriculum? Because these aren't school district yet. I mean, they aren't being told by a school district to align it with what's being used. But
it would just be information
yes.
that we could use as we move forward.
Yes, yeah, that's a good. You get credit for that, for the stimulus for that thought there. Yeah, we have to keep credit now. As you're getting older, you have to start keeping credit for the ideas.
Yeah, I should also say that we're sorry, you just inspired me too. We're hopeful that some of the questions from today's discussion, as we have sort of a few more months of work ahead of us, we're really trying to synthesize a lot of data that I actually think hopefully will benefit the agency down the road, even in terms of informing decisions and sort of the development of initiative and supports. I think a lot of the findings from PEG are potentially helpful with a lot of the other conversations going on at EEC, but we are in the process of trying to finalize a lot of our sort of reports and briefs, and so we're going to sort of take into account your particular questions and try to incorporate as much as we can, both in what we're reporting back at the end of our contract, but also to the extent that we do have the capacity to gather any additional details over the next few months can talk with EC about if that makes sense. Yes,
and
Sheila.
I wanted to tell Joni, in Lawrence, our child care centers and grades 1 and kindergarten in our public schools are aligned with curriculum in many cases. I knew he was
Right. Well, I think we can learn something from that just as much as if they're not aligned. What's
Why
the
not?
outcome
Right.
of that?
So when you hear Greg Duncan talk, he talks about this. Greg Duncan about why there might not be a carryover sometimes of effects is this lack of alignment and the fact that we sort of start over again every year, oh, we're going to start there again. So these are really good.
It doesn't have to be the box curriculum, but
No.
as you say, it's aligned with state standards. But I think that will help with professional development in the future.
Okay, and I think what's unusual about this evaluation, first of all, that it's 4 years is great because it gives you some time to change your questions, change what you're collecting. But I think I'm going to talk really briefly about the impact evaluation, which I think most of you have heard, so we're going to spend very little time on it again. But I consider it the bedrock finding. If you didn't have this finding, it would make you a little nervous about trying to look for other relationships, because if we can't show that this program works, why do we care about what's making it not work? But since we have this finding, it was a very important, I think, first stage that we really want to take beyond here. And the other thing I think is also important is that even though every state could make a number of decisions that were different, there is sort of a test of a model here when the federal government put this out, of this mixed delivery idea. And the fact that the findings across all these states who did this kind of evaluation are amazingly similar. I mean, you almost couldn't believe how similar the actual impact estimates are. Makes you think it's sort of a replication, which we don't often get in education, to say, oh, it's so different we really don't know. But this actually, we have replicated this finding across a number of different states. So I think I'm really glad that we have this finding to work with. And so I'll say it, I think most of you have heard this, but I'm going to go through it quickly again. If you remember, we used what was called a regression discontinuity design, which is something that we can use in the absence of being able to randomly assign children to different programs, which is not what we want to do ethically, but it's really what we want to do kind of methodologically, and we can't do that. And so by using this idea of having a firm birth date, we can compare the kids who are just on either side of that birth date, almost because we don't think that your birth date is going to necessarily be related to your outcome at the end. And so we did the study where we were comparing the kids who just missed PEG to the kids who got into PEG, and the closer they are to that birth date, the more you could almost make the case that they're like a random assignment of the same child. And this design in general is considered to be a very strong design, and it's been used probably now 10 or 12 times in early childhood, because we've had so much trouble in early childhood figuring out how to get a really strong design to ask about the impact. And I think Jocelyn has been very aware and very involved in the methodology of this. This is a kind of sophisticated methodology in the sense that you can make small changes in the models you use or who you include can make a difference in your findings. So you're trying to be very careful that you know what the caveats are and you know sort of what the limitations are and what models we used and did we use the right models. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about this, and luckily enough, Jocelyn is enough of a methodologist herself that she could actually weigh in.
Interested, I believe the report that details all of this is
so
in your
much.
folder.
So much you wouldn't want to know, right? But in any case, if you remember, these were the findings for one cohort of PEG, year 2 versus year 3. The year 2 kids had just finished PEG. The year 3 kids were just coming on. And again, these impacts are larger for the early literacy and early math. Both, the first 3 are all statistically significant, but 0.92 and 0.45. And as I said, we're getting the same level of finding in other studies. And I don't think it's a mystery that it's easier to get kids to learn things that actually have some, almost, when I say a factoid, letters, sounds, those are real things. We can put our fingers on it. Vocabulary is harder. Vocabulary isn't something you can teach somebody, like I can teach you enough vocabulary. It's like studying for the SAT. You cannot study enough vocabulary to know what words they're going to ask. So typically we get less of an effect on vocabulary than we do on early literacy specifically. But that's about the same size effect. Some people have gotten a little more than that. But in some ways, this is the, as we pointed out before, I think this is the big challenge for early childhood, is to get effects on that kind. That's really almost like your larger conceptual knowledge. It's what you need to really be able to take advantage of reading. When you read a new word, when you read a new idea, you've got to have a place to put it in that scaffold in your brain, those semantic networks. And if you don't have a strong set of semantic connections, it's really going to hold you back. So we wish. This is, I think, a challenge for all of us in early childhood, how to really move that marker on vocabulary. We measured executive function, which is not true for every one of these studies, so we don't have as many comparison points. But as you can see, it was not statistically significant. It's always a disappointment. It is a very specific skill we look at, and I don't know if you've read much about, but lately the world of social emotional development is being parsed smaller and smaller and smaller. There are lots of little pieces of what makes you able to negotiate academic and social tasks, and this was really asking about your ability using a kind of a persistent attention machine where they ask you to respond and then not respond as the stimulus change. So touch it when it's a red heart, don't touch it if it's a red heart next to a blue diamond. And we're not so good at this, by the way, by the time we get to be older. We all tested ourselves on it. And there was a very bad correlation between the age of the staff, and I believe I did the worst, thinking I was doing just marvelously, you know, and then someone who was 20 did much faster than I did. So. So it's a disappointment, but not unexpected. I think there's a lot of controversy about how malleable some of these, we used to talk about traits, people having traits, and we sort of got away from that. But it's not clear to us how malleable some of these really important executive function kinds of skills are. So not unexpected, always a disappointment, but not unexpected.
I think the only thing I would say in relation to this is that it's also true that if we were to organize for curriculum and outcomes, we would all prioritize the 2 that are the lowest.
Correct.
In other words, so I think on the one hand, maybe not unexpected, but I think there's enough data out there and there's enough known to suggest it's critical to double down on the knowledge building, the conceptual reasoning, and the routines and emotion regulation that is dumping into EF. Now, we can argue about malleability, but there's enough long-run data to suggest there are features of the learning environment that build those skills.
Right.
So I do think we don't want to lose the idea that, these tend to be early, quick wins. And they're not bad. They don't have long-run purchase.
Right.
The way the vocab and the EF will, by the way, on the kind of math skills and STEAM that we all care about long run.
Yes.
One question though, do we know how the group started? So what was the pre-intervention?
They were all below the mean, but they were not 2 standard deviations below the mean, but they were.
That they were already very ahead in executive function, so we saw very little gain.
No, particularly the kids. Interesting enough, as we know, the bigger effects were on the kids who came in not knowing English as well, and the kids who had had no prior child care experience. Now, partly that could be that they had further to go. It's a little easier to move people when they're starting quite low and you get some gain. But when we looked at the children who spoke Spanish, for instance, they were at age on their Spanish skills. They were not at age on their English skills, but they were moving up. So there's a lot of small pieces that are some learning there. But I think this is what Greg Dickinson calls fragile skills in a way. You know, the skills that you really care about are the ones on the right, because they're the ones that continue, you know, it's like they keep on giving, you know, after you get them.
There's either accumulation or lack thereof,
right?
And
right.
it's sort of the compounding effect.
Yes.
I think the only other thing I would say is we don't want to divorce that conversation from that of curriculum.
Correct.
Which is that, you know, we do know a fair amount about the features of curriculum that are more likely to build those skills than other curricula.
Correct.
I always wonder about curriculum and how much we can expect from curriculum, because it seems to me vocabulary and executive function also is as a result of the experiences children have outside of schools. Which is why some kids come prepared for school and others do not, and it takes them longer, I think.
Right, so, but I do think the thing to think about is the curriculum becomes a platform by which to organize the learning environment in ways that will support trying to level that playing field and boost the skills of all. In other words, I mean, some of the science and socials-based curricula in early childhood do a very nice job across the income spectrum, for example. Yeah.
And I think we've learned a lot in the last decade or so about early literacy and early math curricula. That's, I mean, you know, that's a big change from what it was 20 years ago. Yeah. I think many places the teachers are actually trained in how to promote understanding of how to learn the basics of reading, the basics of math. I think trying to promote vocabulary is a very different thing. You yourself have to be a vocabulary generator. You yourself have to be able to help kids make connections among ideas and concepts, and that's harder. And so from a professional development point of view, I do think this is where the crying need is for all, you know, to be able to do that kind of scaffolding of language and that kind of feedback that gets kids to build their knowledge of an idea. It's some of the hardest things to get for all of us to do, I think.
But also, that's why these out-of-school time experiences are so important, because they're not classroom-based. They're field trips and getting children involved with projects that are outside the normal curriculum environment. Those, and including families in those too, I think.
Sure.
So that there's discussion over dinner or whatever.
Sure.
This is a very helpful discussion. I'm wondering if we can turn our attention to the early literacy and early math findings for just a moment, because we know that those are not unimportant in any way. How does the magnitude of these effects compare to some of the other well-studied, often public pre-K programs in the country? How did the magnitude of these effects compare relative to others?
Yeah,
we had a slide on that last time. I'm sorry we can't reproduce it.
I know.
Right.
I think for early literacy, it's comparable, if not higher, than some of the other studies. And something that's also worth noting is, again, a reminder that these are community-based classrooms. A lot of the other rigorous studies that have been done outside, perhaps, of some of the PEG ones recently are in public school as well. And so if I'm remembering that table correctly, I think the early math, early literacy were comparable, if not higher. The vocabulary was slightly lower than some and comparable to others. And we didn't have executive function comparisons, unfortunately, that we felt comfortable making. So, yeah, sure.
So unless we have more to talk about the child index, we're going to move to some information you haven't seen before, which is not. Oh, sorry. Yes, my mother would have told me I never needed a microphone. She'll be happy to hear it. So now we're going to go to some of the other outcomes. They aren't as rigorous. We don't have the same kind of comparison group designs or rigorous designs, so we all have to be a little careful about over-interpreting these findings. But we're going to start with some family outcomes. And as you know, PEG wasn't really set up as a two-generation program. It wasn't the kind of program that was intended explicitly to be building parent skills as well as child learning. However, we can see sort of the pre-post, and this will help because you can see where they started. Even though these families were disadvantaged in terms of their income, you can see 73% of the fathers were employed at least part-time when they started. However, by the end of the program, you do see an increase in some of the economic indicators, which are, you know, we consider them protective factors in children's lives. We don't think it was that PEG went out and helped them get job skills, but that PEG was the support for working parents. It was all day, all year, which is not true for many programs. And so it really facilitated parents' ability to get and keep jobs. And so, again, we're not calling this a cause and effect as much as by offering that kind of program, it really encouraged other outcomes for families that are also almost as important for children as some of the early childhood environment changes we can make.
And that the symbols indicate, oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that the symbols indicate statistical significance with the pre-post differences. So the things on the slides here were found to be statistically significant.
And to be fair, there were 4 or 5 other indicators that we tested that were not significant. For instance, parent education didn't change significantly over this time. The mother's employment status did not change significantly. The receipt of certain family services didn't, and a measure of parent self-efficacy did not change. So it's always unfair to show you only the things that change. So about half the things we looked at changed, about half we did. That's above chance. So if only one had changed, you might have been a little nervous about just showing it. But it looks like there's something going on here in terms of parents being able to work. And you know, I think we don't know what the carryover effect of a very well-structured, a program that takes education and learning and attendance seriously. We don't know what the sort of carryover effect of that in families. But in any case, those are some of the family outcomes we have. We have a lot of other data about parent opinions about the program, parents' sense of their connection to teachers. But these were sort of the ones that came closest to the kind of outcomes that we can draw a line from these to better outcomes for children. Okay, the next thing we looked at was this issue of attendance. You know, it's kind of a hot topic today that there is this problem with attendance, and attendance was actually an emphasis in PEG in terms of what families were told it was important for children to come to PEG. And I remember that sometimes when this is your first child care experience, your first early childhood experience, the idea that you should come every day is not necessarily something that you drink with the water, like, you know, and so they really worked hard, and almost 90% of the parents actually talked about the importance of attendance by the end of the program, which is very nice. And really what's interesting is we did follow up the children into kindergarten and first grade. Now, we can't follow individual children and get IDs. What we went to school districts and found the PEG children and compared them to the other low-income children in those classes. So we don't know what they got. Some of them could have been in the pre-K program. Some of them could have been in Head Start. We don't know what the early child experience was, but if you can see that the PEG attendance, the attendance of the PEG children was, and that's statistically significant on both of those, was significantly higher than the other low-income children in the same school districts. And not only just the average, but the percent of kids who are chronically absent, which is what everybody's worried about now, the kids who miss a lot of days. And so it's not unimportant that this is sort of, we could think of this as a carryover of the PEG effect on making attendance really important. So I think this is an important issue for everybody, and the fact that these kids are now going to school more often, that's a fairly large difference in the number of kids who are missing 10% of the days of the school year. So
just a clarification on this, though, Barbara, the non-PEG group on this slide is not the control group.
No, it's all the other kids in the school district who are.
The gray bar is actually just all other children in that school district.
Who are disadvantaged.
Thanks.
Yes, no. Right, there could be many other things different about them.
And this was, you know, administrative data that we collected from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
You wish you could go in and continue to assess them, or we wish we had a kindergarten assessment, as we always have, to know, does it really make a difference when you get to kindergarten? But that's just a different issue. Okay, so now we're at the point where we say, well, the children have benefited from PEG. There looks like there's some family carryover into both the families' economic indicators and their understanding of the importance of getting their kids to school and of education. So what's going on in PEG that might be actually explaining some of this? Sure.
So I don't want to leave the families yet.
Okay, go back.
I think these data are really significant, particularly when we look at absence, because we know what the trajectory would be. And I don't know if this is for future work or not, but EEC is collecting a lot of information about family engagement beyond the economic piece of it. We're really looking, you mentioned protective factors, we're looking at families' understanding of child development, their ability to deal with transitions among and between community-based programs. And to David's earlier point, some of our very small grants are really looking at this, you know, right on the ground. And I think it might behoove us, just because a little extra work is always needed, to look at what some of those other family engagement components are that we're measuring and really diving deeply into from other initiatives, how they affect these programs. And I mean, I'm thinking some of it will come out, but that's not a lens that we're looking at right now.
No, it's true, and I think the role of families, as we know, pretty much sort of swamps the role of your early childhood study, what you bring from your family and the background you come in with. So if we can figure out a way to support parents in ways that will make them also be able to support their children, it's a real win for us.
It's kind of our motto, huh? But also, just to mention the work that both EEC and ESC are doing with family engagement, and some of the national work that we're engaged in. And I don't know at what point the framework will roll out, but all of that together.
Yep.
Thanks.
And we have other data from families that we're going to be hope to be able to put into some briefs, and that's the kind of data. I mean, the impacts are really important, but these are the kind of data that actually might inform some of the other discussions about what should be our policies, what we should be doing as a state.
I'm sorry. I just. While these are statistically significant and clinically meaningful, I imagine improvements, they're still very alarming graphs here about
the amount of
very alarming.
Oh, totally.
Yes. So I'm very alarming. I'm just wondering if it's possible for anyone to share with us. Right. No, just to share with us. I think this is really for you. It doesn't have to be now. Maybe on email later. What else is happening to address this? Because I imagine there are a lot of things. Because this is one of the things that should make us lose sleep, I think. And I don't think we're thinking that this is the only solution to that. Yeah. So if someone could let us know at some point, and it'll help us, I think, reflect back how to align different efforts if we know that they are.
That's correct. I think that's a great point, and also just, again, a perfect illustration of the importance of connecting the work of EEC with the work of DESE, right? Because it's the same families across the spectrum, younger siblings, older siblings, the outreach that we're doing, the engagement that we're doing with families and with schools to help achieve common outcomes, such as school attendance, is critical.
I'm going to suggest process-wise that you move through, that if we have a clarification, we call it out in real time, but I would say otherwise let's move through and then have a discussion and hear about the CPPI and then have a larger discussion. Does that sound fine? We'll let you keep going, pick up the pace.
Okay, so we're going into what's going on inside the box of the PEG programs, and now we have 4 years of data on the class. And I think, as we've known, these classrooms have done very well on 2 of the 3 components of the class, where you see them up in the, in the class 5, 4, between 3 and 5 is considered moderate quality, 6 and 7 is high, but they're up at the high end of the moderate. So, and starting from the beginning to the end, there is an increase. There is this kind of interesting slight drop in the last year, which is not significant, and it could be for a number of reasons, either teachers leaving, changeover in teachers, or just slight as programs are starting to end and people are uncertain. So we don't make a lot of the change from the third to the 4th year, but the important thing for us is that there was growth, that the program managed to continue to increase the quality. It's always, when you put this, everyone always jumps to the instructional support and how much lower it is. I want to say scores of 3 are far better than when Bob Pianta put out his first data on this. The average across a lot of different early childhood programs was between 1 and 2. This has been notoriously the hardest part in his instrument to get high scores on. So 3 is not something to bemoan. However, it is, as you can see, there's one story here, which is this is where you need to get your professional development for teachers, really figuring that out.
And I also wanted to note, so the vertical lines show the amount of variability of scores in each year within each domain. There's a lot of variation when you start looking across classrooms, and you can see that some of the variability may have shrunk a bit in instructional support, especially compared to the first year.
So it looks like the lower scores in the first 2 years, we bring them in a little. It's not bringing everybody up higher because some of the top ones are coming down a little too, but it's like they're getting more consistent. So, okay. And then when you actually, this is just a point to say that over time, the teachers in PEG, more and more of them had higher degrees. We're not necessarily saying PEG caused this, but that the context in which the children in PEG were getting their inputs were coming from teachers who had more than what was required in terms of their education. Okay. This is the one that probably is of more interest, which is how much training they got and what's changed over time. And I think the real change has been in the amount of training that has gone to the non-lead teachers. So I think PEG over time moved to more of a team PD approach, which is often recommended but doesn't happen because of the need to cover the classrooms while teachers are getting trained. But over time, as you can see, the non-lead teachers were getting more and more hours of PD, which I think is another important thing that PEG has been able to do that not every program has been able to do. So you can see those are the number of hours of training, and we're talking about by year 3 they're getting 30 hours of training and 22 hours of coaching. You might wish in our ideal world that were more, but compared to other programs, PEG has really made a real effort to try and support the teachers, and I think it probably goes along with some of the quality scores as well. You haven't seen this before. It's the cost pie, and the average per child cost, excluding Boston, was $18,000 for a PEG program. And the reason Boston is excluded is because of more complicated funding sources, not because we thought Boston shouldn't be in here. It's just it was a little more apples to oranges there. And so you can see that the biggest part of the pie is for classroom staff. But of course, the second biggest part of the pie is operations, which is, you wish all of that could go into the red, but it can't. And so we wanted you to see, we have another slide that's going to show you a comparison to costs of other programs.
And operations includes facilities as a large, like rental sort of space is a large portion of that, as well as equipment and supplies and support for administrative staff within the building.
Sorry, Noni, I know you wanted us to hold questions, but just on the operations side of the equation, I'm just confused about how many programs were operating in existing buildings and how many needed to rent new space.
New space.
And I don't necessarily need it just seems like this is a high proportion, assuming there might be somewhere it would be 0, because you're just opening a new classroom in the same building.
Well, but even
that means
then,
this might be even
the
higher.
cost of the rent was included in the cost of the program in many cases. So for example, Head Start programs can't charge Head Start for the rent or the cost of a classroom that is not a Head Start classroom.
So they prorated some portion of the overhead to pay.
And even in other programs, they had to account for the rent in some way, shape, or form. So it wasn't the full cost of the space if it was one classroom, but they would still include the cost of that classroom.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Got it.
Just a quick point of clarification as well. The total that you're citing as the average per child cost is higher than the per child cost afforded by the PEG grant alone. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into the sort of the methodology that you use to capture cost and where additional funds may have come from?
So I think, let me just make sure I'm understanding the question, because you're going back to the way we calculated what the grant to the programs should be when we, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I thought it was like 16.5. per
Yeah,
child?
so this includes, so that was to calculate grants to the program. This includes costs at all levels. So it isn't just the program, like the ELP costs, it's also the costs that the districts contributed to this. It doesn't include the state infrastructure piece, which one can also have a discussion about. But
We did, we did in a separate report also try to quantify the state support piece as well, because I think that has been a piece of the model here in terms of support. So.
The next slide.
Oh, yeah.
So here's the slide where we actually tried to compare the cost of PEG. It's not always easy to do because PEG being an all-day, all-year program, you have to sort of fix the costs or weight the other costs so that what they would be if they were a full day, full year. But you can see when you do it that way on the far right column, PEG is not more expensive than the public school programs. It is more expensive than some of the community-based care programs. But I think all this tells you that to do good early childhood is not cheap. You know, I did a bunch of work in New Mexico where their per child cost in their public schools is $4,500 a year per child. So when you see what it takes to do a program, and we aren't even satisfied, you know, we'd like to do more for these children. We'd like to have more PD for teachers. We'd like to have more. And so I just think this is, I think it's important that people understand what it really costs to do this kind of program. Anybody have any questions yet about this slide? No? We can come back to it if that's where people want to talk. Okay.
Okay. So this fall, we also observed, as I mentioned earlier, and collected survey data from non-PEG classrooms, all of the non-PEG classrooms in the same communities, in the same agencies where the PEG classrooms sat. We chose these classrooms to be as similar as possible, so they all include at least half of the kids in these classrooms were kindergarten eligible the year after. And again, we gathered data from all of them that sort of met the criteria of being similar, so that we could see if it appears that PEG resources and supports are resulting in different experiences for teachers and directors, as well as classroom quality levels. So we did find that PEG classrooms had significantly higher scores on the 3 class domains in year 4 of the program compared to the non-PEG classrooms within these communities. I also wanted to note that in 3 of the communities, we were able to we were able to do observations in the public school pre-K classrooms, and in those 3 communities, the PEG classrooms also were significantly higher on the class than the public school pre-K, which is noteworthy. These boxes are the mean score, and again, you can see the range by the vertical lines here, and this was just one point in time in the fall of 2018. According to survey data, so really quickly, we asked a bunch of questions of PEG and non-PEG teachers, PEG and non-PEG directors, or directors of PEG and classrooms versus directors of non-PEG classrooms, both about the supports available as well as sort of what the organizational culture and climate were using a standard scale. It does appear that teachers are reporting that they're receiving more training and coaching, perhaps not surprisingly, given the emphasis of this on PEG in the 4th year of the program. And in addition, when we have sort of a lot of details within this, there are a lot of differences in terms of the focus of the training and the coaching they're getting. For example, I think about 80% of PEG teachers are receiving coaching on curriculum compared to about 30% of non-PEG teachers. And again, these are teachers that are within agencies that are sort of overseeing all of them. And so it does appear that the PEG supports were targeted differently, which we didn't know what to expect, because sometimes there may be things offered to everybody, right?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? When you're talking about supports regarding curriculum, are you talking about content and skill development as well as instructional practices?
So we didn't gather a lot of detail about what the curricula-focused coaching and training, like at a deeper level, what the exact focus of it is. So I couldn't speak to that, although that's something we could probably learn more about from sort of digging further with programs. I don't know if you...
I can only speak to what happened in the PEG programs. Sorry, all I said is I could only speak to what happened in the PEG program, so what the classrooms that are not PEG funded, what they were reporting in that category.
But even the PEG ones received instructional practice as well as what to teach, but how to teach.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we used a bunch of questions from a really interesting measure that has been developed by the Ounce of Prevention Fund in collaboration with the University of Chicago Consortium that really focuses on trying to measure organizational conditions within buildings and the supports that are, how supported teachers are feeling within the building. So we focused on 3 of their essentials: collaborative teachers, effective instructional leaders, and involved families. And these bars indicate sort of the level of endorsement of sort of an aggregated group of items. It's a little complicated to try to explain this, but basically the higher bars reflect more positive sort of reporting on a variety of items within each of the essentials. So for example, on average, 84% of the PEG lead teachers endorsed items in the effective instructional leader category compared to 75% of non-PEG lead teachers. So PEG teachers were overall more likely than non-PEG teachers to indicate high collaboration among teachers, involvement of families, as well as perceptions of the leadership of their program as being supportive and sort of effective in their roles. And we have a lot more details on these items. And the Ounce of Prevention actually provided some training to the communities and to the programs to help the programs really understand their own data, which I think was really helpful. And the programs were happy to have access to some of this data to generate discussions about sort of where to go from here. PEG teachers reported higher job satisfaction on the items that we surveyed them about, as well as sort of a commitment to remaining in teaching. So I won't say any more about that. And similarly, PEG program directors reported feeling more support. Again, part of this experience in the PEG model was coming together with other directors in a very structured way within the community, as well as interacting with EEC staff fairly intensively. So perhaps this is, and the collaboration with the public school districts, so this is probably not surprising. So again, we've tried to cover today sort of impacts on kids, outcomes for families, classroom quality over time, as well as providing some information about PEG classrooms versus non-PEG classrooms. I want to make sure to give time to Jocelyn to talk about where to go from here. But again, we're in the process of really finalizing a lot of our reports and briefs, and are excited to get those out there both to the board as well as the field.
Thank you. So, in thinking about what we take from this and where we're going, I have to have it like in my mouth. I think I just want to, before getting into sort of what we've been pulling out of these findings at a high level, I want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, just a reminder that everything that happened in the PEG programs were designed by the programs in the community. I mean, I think the biggest criticism of PEG when we went in is it was a broad set of requirements without a whole lot of specificity about what actually was supposed to happen. So what the results that you saw today were the results of the work of our current system. It wasn't a boutique program. It wasn't something that was brought in externally to our programs. And I just think that that's important to recognize. And it did involve, significant support from us as well, facilitating, providing opportunities for communities to come together and have the time to talk and think about what they were doing and share ideas. But this is the work of the communities, and I think that that's important to remember. The other piece, too, that isn't, I hope it comes out in some of the concrete data that we shared, but in talking to folks that have participated in PEG about, sort of what has been different in their experience in the PEG program from working in other programs. There is a qualitative difference that is consistently discussed around the professionalism and the experience of being treated as a professional and being provided with an opportunity to really meaningfully engage in developing as a professional that is deeply rewarding and something that really people want to hold on to in their programs, even looking beyond beyond PEG. So I just, you know, I don't feel like I wish I could bring voices to the table to share that, but I'm trying to reflect what we've been hearing.
I think those are 2 important points, really big. It's hard to measure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we see it in some of the concrete numbers around sort of how much opportunities there are for different types of collaboration and training. But it also affected the experience of participants. So, and thinking in a very high-level way what we would take away from PEG and then might try to sort of bring into other places in our work. I think, first of all, that, you know, these improvements are possible, and they're possible in our system. We do see improvements in classroom quality. We do see differences in the way teachers are talking about themselves as professionals. At the same time, we also would note that there are great differences in the supports and the resources that are provided to these programs, and particularly around the supports that are provided to the program leadership. And that is certainly something that I think we as an agency, in thinking about the QRIS and some of our other work, are thinking very seriously about the TA systems that we're developing, and how to build those pieces in. Sorry, I'm trying to read my handwriting. And then also in thinking about the impacts that we saw for children and the experience of families in this program, I might have worded this a little differently, but a program that intentionally targeted and then provided additional supports to underserved families did yield positive impacts for the children, and, you know, the suggestion of some differences for families. And thinking at the state level about some of the issues beyond sort of how do we continue this work, the braiding of funding seems really, really critical to get a handle on. You know, PEG was federally funded. There was a lot of money available to programs to do this work. It is not even when you contextualize the $18,000 or so per child in the context of other programs, it's a lot of money for one funding source to bear. It's also important to recognize not every family needs full day, full year, but it's important to have that option available to families and to have it available at a high quality. So, you know, that is a piece that I think as an agency we should be thinking about. And then the other piece I made reference to this, but, you know, our participation in the work of these communities was important from a facilitation point of view. Again, we weren't, you know, telling people what to do, but we were trying to ask questions and structure conversations that would help move the work forward. So I would say these sort of the high-level lessons learned that we've brought into other work and the CPPI work going forward.
Can I add one? It seems to me that there's an important lesson for the state that's missing here.
Okay, please.
If I'm understanding the data correctly, what it seems to suggest is that we have a model using the existing mixed delivery system, a partnership between local school districts and community-based providers that we're showing is capable of producing results as good, if not better, than the most expensive public school pre-K programs in the country, and that we're able to do it comparatively at lower cost. And so I think that there's a very strong argument to be made for the cost efficiency and merit of this model that leverages our existing mixed delivery system in a powerful way to benefit children's school readiness.
Thank you, Joan.
So can we talk about that for a minute on the benchmark of the pre-K? What I didn't quite follow the frame of reference, and and as a result, I wasn't so sure about that claim. Is that right?
You're talking about comparing
whether the effects are the same as we're getting in the sort of
and that the public pre-K costs.
Oh, the costs.
Oh, do you want to go back to that?
Yeah, let me go back to that slide.
There's another, I think, a fuller explanation of your cost of quality study.
Yeah, in a report. Yeah.
And I think just to be clear,
that doesn't quite line up with that.
But in the report?
Yeah. Right?
Saying that there's this kind of comparison between
the report. No, this isn't in the report.
I'm understanding the cost study that was included in the board book. There's no correlation that was found.
Oh,
between costs and outcomes.
And quality.
Oh, yeah, we did. Yes, that is correct.
And I think just to be clear what this is not an in-depth cost analysis of all these different programs. It's really just taking, you know, for example, the public schools. Yes, sir.
Yeah. This is a cost comparison. It doesn't make a connection to the quality.
Yeah, no,
absolutely not. That is correct.
Right.
Yes.
But you're saying, Joan, you're using Boston, for example, right, as 180 days. 20,000 a child, which if you modeled and projected out to the 260, you'd be at 36 per child, 36K.
Right. So
you're saying this is ultimately cheaper, if you will. Now, I think Boston has their infrastructure costs baked into that 20, right? And or that 36, that some of which are not baked in to the 18 for the PEG. Am I right about that?
In some small cases, yes. But, I mean, so in Holyoke, I think some of the the costs of the building aren't in there because the public schools provided the buildings for free. Those are the types of things you're talking about, Noni?
I just asked the source, because school funding, as a lot of us know, are a hot topic these days. The source of the cost per child for the public
this came from the reports that DESE put out. I'm trying to remember which year I used. I think it was 16. So, you know, these are old too, but I was trying to line it up with the cost study of the school spending.
Okay, because sometimes it has to do with the full day versus part day, and I just want to make sure it's
I'll have to go back and look. They did break it down by
But it's by preschool age group. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So I think there are a lot of nuances in terms of what components are counted toward cost, but I think the differentials are significant enough, and we know that the results are reasonably comparable, that, you know, I'm not sure that, so there's, essentially what I'm making is a cost efficiency argument, more so
I see what you mean. I do.
than, you know.
Yeah. And I think the Boston cost is partly tied to the workforce, which is they're not allowing for the disparities that are that to some degree are inherent in the PEG model. So at the teacher level, and they also have effect sizes a little higher in those harder to move areas. So that's an interesting way to think about some of those differences.
Right, and we can link this also to some of the national data.
Totally.
But it essentially is showing us that we can use our mixed delivery system, our existing infrastructure, to deliver pre-K of quality.
And to do, and not a small issue, to better meet working families' needs. In other words, a lot of the public pre-K, sure, it costs a lot less, but the 2 and 3 hour day is just a non-starter for many, many families.
And for kids, probably.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's actually not enough dosage.
Right, it is not.
Sorry, so, great. We'll keep going.
It's going to move us back.
Probably just violated my own process.
Where am I? So the one other piece I think that we've made reference to in the PEG program but did not talk a lot about during the evaluation component is the collaboration between the public schools and the private providers. There was a survey that was conducted. I think it was very interesting to see the results, particularly in looking at sort of community profiles around different aspects of collaboration. I wouldn't say that there were consistent trends from the beginning to the end of the PEG that were called out from that. Some things got better, some things got worse, and it was very individual, community to community. We did have, we're fortunate enough to have an SRCD predoctoral fellow last year who was able to conduct interviews with 13 of the both ELP and public school staff involved, you know, in the PEG leadership teams and 4 of the communities. And she talked to them about their experiences of participating in the collaboration, and in looking at some of her findings when discussing the role that collaborations played as a context for decision making and for planning. There was fairly consistent agreement that it provided an opportunity for individuals and across, you know, sort of within at a community level to think about and develop shared vision and goals for young children. And it provided a space by which planning that leveraged the strengths of participating organization could happen. So Head Start could bring their experience with family engagement and some of their ideas and thoughts around it. The public school brought their overall perspective of the community and where the children were and who they were serving and who they were struggling with as a system. The private providers each had their own areas of families and, you know, areas of the work that they had focused on. So that could come together through the planning process. This often also strengthened the system of professional supports and made it more consistent across programs, because really these communities were planning together and consistently implementing a set of professional supports. There were some, you know, obviously variation. Some teacher needed something in particular, but there was a baseline of consistency across that. It created an opportunity for them as a group to develop a collective sense of responsibility for families. I mean, I think the public school certainly comes to the table with that, but individual UC licensed programs tend to have their groups of families that they work with. They have their community, they have, you know, their population. And bringing this group together to think about where are the families and what are our goals for everybody in this community, as opposed to how am I filling my seats, was a really important piece of this work. And it also provided an opportunity for them to coordinate resources across agencies, particularly around the outreach, and then also as children transitioned into kindergarten to start developing relationships with the public schools. It was interesting, the first step in that really was much more about bringing kids to kindergarten registration. It took longer than I expected for, you know, people actually to find connections with principals, connections between teachers and teachers, but that eventually was built in. And it wouldn't have happened without the fact that we had the people at the table that we did. And then when asking them about, you know, sort of the aspects of the collaboration, the structures that were essential for making this happen, having a collaborative governance body, having a group of people, it was often a steering committee, sometimes there were multiple levels with an executive level and a subcommittee groups. But having people come together on a regular basis with the decision-making and the planning authority was really, really important. All of this should not in any way, shape, or hide the fact that this is really, really hard. And I could talk for hours on the challenges that they talked about as well. So the facilitation of those meetings was also really, really essential. It had to be clear who was facilitating. It was often somebody from the public school that played that role. Sometimes Sarah and I stepped in as well. But to keep the conversation on track and, you know, to keep bringing people back together to the, you know, most important issue at hand. They also reported that having the data was really, really important. It gave them a shared focus and something concrete to start with to think about where are they going next versus relying on everybody's individual perspectives on where things should go. So I think, you know, a piece of that to us suggests that this collaboration piece does play a very important role, both in the strength of the program, but also in the capacity by which this can really address issues of access, but and also think about issues of alignment.
Can I ask a question here, John? And I just want to build on Joan's comment too, just that the model is the key, and the fact that we've been struggling for a long time, I think, to find a really productive, collaborative way to connect both the private community-based organizations and the public schools in a way that feels professional and productive and respectful across both, and good for the families and the kids. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge win in and of itself if you found a way to do that well. And Amy, at the beginning of your presentation, I just want to thank all of you for all the really terrific thought that's gone into this, and the fact that we've got lessons learned is key from PEG in general. Amy, you had said that Massachusetts is doing something really unique. Mm-hmm. My understanding from PEG was that all grantees were asked to do a collaborative model. But are we doing something different in Massachusetts?
So we were just talking about this the other day.
Amy asked the same question.
Just wanting to go deeper, as actually other reports are coming out from states now to understand what was unique and what might have been different. I think the partnership was required of all states in terms of a local shared governance structure that is sort of structured and intensive as this. I would guess not every state did. I mean, I think other states probably chose different ways of proceeding, but we want to understand that a little bit better too. I do think that probably each state had its unique
So it's a question of walking the talk, right? So
exactly.
You can say you're partnering.
What does partnership mean?
Because you've invited someone to a meeting, or you can actually do all the things on this slide and put in the hard work of saying it's a true collaborative governance structure. Yeah, thanks.
And we don't want to forget that the one thing that everyone wanted more of was an understanding of this transition of kids with special needs, how to deal with them successfully in community-based programs, and then how to transition into the school. And I think they felt that, I mean, they individually expressed that they didn't have the knowledge and skills they wish they had, or the supports to do that. And I think that's a big issue, and it's going to be a bigger issue. And so it's also another place where that kind of partnership could really be seen as really helpful to both sides of the equation here.
Yeah, go.
Do you have an idea, given the importance of that walk the walk, talk the talk with real, true, meaningful partnerships, how that can be built in long term. It's more clear to me how QRIS, the career lattice, the what you showed us about workforce, having points, right? Those can all be operationalized, measured. It can be part of, right, reimbursement or licensing or whatever. But how about that part? Do you have a thought about where that could go?
So it is something that we built into the CPPI grant, and I acknowledge this is a challenging piece of this. So, you know, certainly you can expect it as part of particular grants, and it certainly will come through in the nature, I mean, I'm just thinking about reviewing grant proposals. It comes through in the nature of the proposal. You can tell the difference between a proposal where you can see that different groups of people have come together and actually agreed on something versus proposals where you're kind of like, well, I'll do this and you'll do this and we'll kind of get along and play in the same sandbox, but we're not sharing our toys. Having said that, the piece that I think we do need to figure out, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity with the CPPI, is the implications for the state engagement, because we knew it was happening because we were there and we were part of it happening, and sometimes we were making sure it kept happening. And that is not a long-term and sustainable way for the state to engage if you want to bring something like this to scale. I do think that the PEG timeframe wasn't long enough to really fully understand that, but by year 3 we did not feel essential to those conversations. I think they had a rhythm, they had the relationships. At the same time, I do think that part of what happens with those rhythms and relationships is you stay kind of in the safe zone. Mm-hmm. So there could potentially be a re-engagement at some point in time. Mm-hmm. But I don't, there's an intensive investment up front that's definitely needed, and then how that plays out is something I think we need to think about.
So if we build that out, though, and thinking about the work of the agency and some of this program quality improvement work and workforce development, I mean, an initial upfront is in many ways like what I would say is the right work of the state agency, right? That we mount enough infrastructure momentum, and that's kind of what the QRIS also has baked in as the theory of action, right? We support the early stages of quality improvement and then turn it over to the unit, to the sites. So, you know, it's certainly not. It's certainly encouraging, in my view, that you could get to that. You could get to that steady state. Yep. In a pretty short period of time, if you think about it in some respects, from systems level change.
Yeah, and I think it just then speaks to staging. So so not taking on too much all at once.
Right. So you could imagine some kind of graduated approach to systems level work.
The state is the venture capitalist, and they're like startups. You know, you're investing. Well, no, I mean, you're investing in an organization and a structure, and you're saying, you know, we believe in you. We're going to help you out, and we're going to give you what you can. I mean, that doesn't mean everyone. You know, some of them are going to fail. Right?
That's right, but you can also imagine that you could further accelerate it by virtue of what you've already learned, which is to say there's a little bit of skip to the end, I'm sure, on some of these issues, right? Where we figure out, you know, this is the kind of person, this is the kind of role that was critical, or these were the critical roles at the table, for example. So you know enough about conditions for change to some degree.
Right.
I think the elephant in the room, though, is teacher salaries and the costs.
I do think that's right.
We can talk all we want about how we're going to do this in the future, but until we figure out
how to pay them that much,
So moving on to the CPPI grant, where we did try to take some of these ideas and build it into the context of state funding. Just some basic context, it's been put out as a competitive 3-year grant, so there are now 2 renewals for programs that are communities that are currently grant funded. We're in funding 6 high needs communities. Prioritizing high needs communities was an aspect of this grant. We funded Boston, Lowell, New Bedford, North Adams, Somerville, and Springfield. And the asterisks just reflect PEG communities that are funding expansion of either the PEG model or modified PEG model into new classrooms and new programs. The grants are designed to be classroom level grant. They're not following individual children, which provides the communities with some flexibility about thinking about sort of evening the professional supports across classrooms, as well as the supports that are provided directly to children. And it does, as we've been talking about, require the same public school and private program collaboration as in PEG. So, sort of at a high level, there were a few key goals that we're trying to accomplish through this structure. First of all, using the community level collaboration, as we've talked about, as a lever and a context, not just for program planning and monitoring, managing the program, but for some strategic planning, as well as quality improvement and alignment efforts across the classrooms, and thinking about both horizontal and vertical alignment. So what happens to the kids in K, and how does that build on the experiences that they're putting into these programs in pre-K? Expansion of access continues to be an important aspect of this work, and all of the grantees had conducted local needs assessment and done strategic planning with planning grants in prior years. So this provided an opportunity for them to implement pieces of their plan and think about how can they use these programs to serve the children with the highest needs in their communities. The other piece that we added in, Barbara made reference to this, but certainly a place that I don't think anybody feels the PEG model really kind of cracked the nut on, was this issue of special education and equitable access to special education, both in private EEC licensed programs and in public schools. So this is a place where actually there's more flexibility in state funding than there was with the federal funding, and I think that there's a real opportunity for these for communities to come together and think about this piece of the work.
Yeah, on that note, I was wondering about the PEG findings. When you go to compare to public pre-K, but the public pre-K prevailing theory of change has been to take in very high needs kids, then you're sort of got an apples to oranges, right?
Correct.
Not only on time, but on population.
I think that's correct.
So it would be interesting, it will be critical and interesting over time to kind of try to sort some of that out and pull out, if there are kids with special needs in PEG, to pull out that comparison to sort of start to get a better sense.
Yeah, and certainly the special needs are not as great for the population of kids with special needs in the PEG programs. I mean, the public schools are the ones that serve the highest need.
Yeah, and they're ultimately, in some cases, sort of tilted towards segregated settings that way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we need to look in the public schools at what inclusion looks like in the public schools versus what it looks like in the community-based programs, and how students receive special ed supports, which goes to my question, can you just give an example or two of what are equitable supports?
Yeah, sure.
What do you mean?
So I'll get to it in the next one, but no, it's okay. I can preview. So really, it's bringing the services to the children in the private program, so they do not have to travel to a public school site to receive. Brings the service, right? So that they're, I think all of the programs are funding itinerant services into private programs, which has been a real challenge for public schools to provide. The other piece of that, and then there's some additional interesting models in thinking about bringing special ed certified teachers in as co-teachers and sort of thinking about those pieces. But the other piece is ensuring that there is an access to a full day, full year program in the inclusion classrooms in the public schools, so that that 2-hour day is not inaccessible for a family that is working family. Recognizing as well, I think, that there are certain aspects of the provision of these services that the public schools do the best. And for some children, that might be the best setting.
And we have to look at what services are being provided in what setting. And is that equitable? I don't have the answer.
Yeah, and
I think it's something we need to look at so that something discrete doesn't happen in one setting and something totally different in another.
Yes, although that is a challenging bar.
So I just...
That is the services for special needs kids too, because it's a 0 to 3 group of services that child care accesses.
Early intervention, the early intervention, right.
Yeah, so my question relates to that because school districts are required to provide early childhood programs for 3- and 4-year-olds for children with special needs.
And they do.
And the same legal requirement doesn't exist for their non-disabled peers.
That's correct.
Right? Kindergarten starts at 5. So I guess my question is through these grants, how are we ensuring that legal requirement is met, but also to allow it to happen in an integrated, least restrictive environment?
I'm trying to parse it. So what I'm hearing, why don't I try just making sure I'm understanding the question first of all, is that public schools are required to serve all children with special needs. And they do.
Starting at age 3, yes.
And they do. There is certainly variation in the way in which those services are provided.
Correct.
And what is required of the families or the children to access those services. So this grant does not change the requirement that services would be provided to children. The hope is that it brings more services physically to the location that the child is currently in.
Right, I guess I'm asking, how are these grants being used to support the fulfillment of those legal requirements that exist for children with special needs in ways they don't exist for other children? Because one of the concerns is that in providing programs for young children with special needs, a lot of districts provide a half-a-day program, which, if a child's already developmentally delayed, you would argue that that's insufficient. But I guess if we're going to promote new programs, we should also be focused on how we can enhance and support legal requirements that are already in existence for a certain population.
So let me take a crack at building on Jocelyn's answer to try to address what you're raising, because it's really important. But the public school pre-Ks are serving children with identified special needs. In addition, some of those children may be served in community-based settings. This agency has also historically supported grants like the IPLE, which was focused on supporting the inclusion of quote-unquote typically developing peers in those classrooms in order to ensure mixed settings. And part of what PEG and CPPI permit is for children who have special needs, who are in community-based settings, to have improved access to services in support of those needs on site to reduce the transition and the challenge, so that they're more likely to be in a more robust and inclusive setting than they might otherwise experience.
Oh, I thank you. I appreciate that. And I know that school districts and the parents can agree to allow a child to remain in a community-based setting and not go to a preschool. But the obligation at the preschool level for the local educational agency is for that child to be educated in the least restrictive environment to the maximum extent appropriate, beginning at age 3, which means in a general education classroom, if you will, along with their non-disabled peers. I guess I'm just wondering how this grant will support the fulfillment of that obligation, which already exists, but it should be enhancing that so that we're creating more inclusive settings across the board.
Yeah, no, and I think that is a very good point, and something that I think we can bring back and haven't really hit on. I think the currently grantees are at the point of just thinking about how to work with the range of settings that they have. I think that there are many opportunities to build that inclusion mindset into it, and also to push on that issue of the least restrictive environment.
And what complicates that, and because in my work as a volunteer as the SPEDPAC chair in Boston, is a lot of times we had preschool programs where children with special needs actually weren't in specific, longer day wraparound programs because they come in throughout the school year based on their 3rd birthday. And so programs were filled, which means they went into substantially separate settings by default because there were no seats left in those integrated settings. I'm just thinking that, it sort of has to work in tandem where, working across the board for all programs to make sure that the mindset is always to be in most integrated and inclusive setting as possible for all children. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I think I've already talked about the sustainable funding piece. But what we're trying to get at with this particular leg of the grant is understanding the costs of the programs as they're currently being implemented, and the total cost, not just what's being grant funded, and the funding sources that communities are bringing to the table to make this program work. I'm not going to spend any time on this. You have it. It just tells you a little bit more about where the money's going and who's being served. So I think I can go through this pretty quickly because a lot of this we've already touched on, but this is sort of how we've operationalized those goals. There's a requirement that steering committees or some sort of regularly convening leadership structures with cross-agency participation are in place, and that they have structures in place to help them focus on, to think about, to do the planning work and have some of the alignment and access discussions that are necessary. Coordinated quality improvement is coordinated across the programs. It's not just individually classroom-focused quality improvement, and alignment is part of that as well. That there is thinking about how access will be expanded and where and how that access should be expanded. At this point in the grant, it's really thinking about what is the outreach and enrollment plan for next year. Who are they? Who do these communities really want to make sure that they are bringing in to fill the seats that are opening up for next year? Supports for additional needs was what was in PEG, comprehensive services. Comprehensive services are not required in this grant, but there is an opportunity for programs and communities to identify particular needs in their communities that they want to address. So bringing in behavioral and mental health consultants is a very, I think it's part of everybody's grant. In some places, thinking about supports around understanding trauma-informed care is a piece that's come in. And this connects to the inclusion, but also funding OT, PT, and speech supports, both proactively as well as a special education provision. And these are supports that can be used as classroom consultation and, sort of working with the teacher around their practices. These are also supports that are in some cases going directly to families. Inclusion, I think we just talked about, and as with the funding model, so I won't spend more time on those. And just really quickly, concretely, what are we actually expecting in the few months we have of FY19? I think it's important to recognize that this is a 3-year process, and this has been a really short turnaround period to get this program up and running. So there's some pretty concrete things that we just want to have in place by the end of the year. Again, the management structures and the planning structures in place, and some plan for data collection, because we know that it's going to become an important part of the grant. Anything that has been planned around the quality improvement training and coaching should be in place, as well as, again, the long-term thinking around alignment and where our grantee is going with the coordination of the quality improvement efforts. And all staff, I'm not going to say this on all of this, but effectively any staff connected to any of these categories are expected to be hired. Expansion of access, it's really thinking about enrollment for next year and the availability of a full-day, full-year program for working parents in all settings. I think for the supports for additional needs and inclusion, it's really around, again, the staff and the full-day option. And we want programs to document their costs and think about the funding sources that they'll be using next year. Oops, what did I just do? Oh, God.
I think you pressed them. Guess the party's over.
I don't know what I pressed. So our next steps, we're going to continue to support local steering committees, and we've been out to every community now, and we'll continue to go out probably monthly as our schedule allows. Through this process, we are also trying to identify areas for technical assistance. One place that we want to start is around supports for the continuous quality improvement work and the data collection efforts that communities might participate in. There's a lot of interest in the plans for the new QRIS system, and as we are developing things like the curriculum rubric, the CQIP template, we can share those with these communities and really support the process of both, sort of test driving, but also using them as a framework to guide quality improvement. There's a lot of interest in doing that. There are a couple of communities that want to look at the curriculum and think about a community-wide curriculum, and that would be a nice point of integration. We will have a renewal process, and we'll look at those plans with a clarity around the path to full implementation in mind, so sort of understanding how they're going to be getting to that point, and we will monitor enrollment and quality improvement efforts. Right now, we're collecting enrollment information. We'll continue to do that, and as data is available on quality, we will gather that as well. Thank you.
Any last comments or questions for the group? It was Preschool Expansion Day. Joan.
So I want to first just begin by thanking all of you. I know how much work went into supporting the communities and making this possible over the last 4 years, and also just the tremendous amount of work that goes into the data collection and analysis. So thank you for bringing this forward. Part of what's really exciting about what you're sharing is that we do see that what we are aiming to do is possible, and really the sort of core initial mission of this agency to support improved access to high quality pre-K has a really strong foundation. I want to just for a moment tie together what we have from PEG and what we have from CPPI in FY19. Because if I understand it correctly, we have approximately 1,200 children currently enrolled in about 72 classrooms across both programs in 8 communities. If we don't find some mechanisms to support sustainability in FY20 on PEG, we are at very great risk of going backward for comparatively low dollars. And so I think the agency and also perhaps the administration can be thinking about how we don't move backward, given the magnitude of positive effects that we know that this work is capable of having for children and families and the Commonwealth.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all. I just want to second that. I do think, and I mentioned this when we had our last budget discussion. I mean, we need to think through the momentum here, and we need for the budget and the state and the board's work to not get behind where the field is. I mean, in many respects. So I appreciate that, Joan. Thank you. And thank you all. That was great. All right, our second, thank you, yes. Our second agenda item, I want to introduce Katie DeVita and Ola Friday on this the FY19 state budget authorized a Early Education and Care Workforce Council, charging them with making recommendations on improving and enhancing professional development and higher ed opportunities for the early education and care workforce, and sort of taking a strategic lens. And that means, my understanding is we're going to receive a nomination of individuals who will comprise that council. And put Katie and Ola will put that before us for a vote to authorize that slate of individuals who would make up that council. And certainly we've talked about this at Workforce, how it is that we can manage and be productive with another council also. So I do want to flag that for the board, because we want to be sure that this is positive and a helpful channel for the agency staff, and that bolsters our work collectively. So I want to just flag that we've had those discussions at the Workforce Development Committee. So Katie, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm here today. I'm going to bring you the remaining recommendations for membership for the EEC Workforce Council.
Right.
And before Katie gets started, because I am not doing any talking today, I'm just here for moral support, just wanted to really thank her for her thoughtful and thorough steership of this process. She did a really great job. So all yours, Katie.
Thank you. So let's get to the next slide before we get started. I get it, thanks. So as Noni stated, the Early Education and Care Workforce Council was authorized by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts fiscal year 2019 state budget. As stated in the FY19 state budget, the EEC Workforce Council is tasked with making recommendations on improving and enhancing professional development and higher education opportunities for the early education and care workforce, and supporting the development and implementation of workforce development vision and strategic initiatives. The focus of this council is also to bring together different perspectives and content experts to support and guide EEC and its partners in this work. So, Section 79 of the outside section states that the council Workforce Council membership must include all the organizations listed here. In addition to all of those organizations, there have been 8 additional members that were appointed by legislative leadership. And then what we're here for your vote today is on the additional appointees. So in addition to representatives from the agencies included on the slide, as well as the legislative leadership appointees, there is the opportunity for additional appointments made by the EEC Workforce Council to Commissioner Weber and to the board. So to meet this recommendation, the EEC Workforce Council came up with the membership working group, which was tasked with providing the recommendations to you and to Commissioner Weber as well on additional members for the EEC Workforce Council. The members from the current EEC Workforce Council that volunteered to be on this additional working group were MJ Burns from the Wilmington School Committee, Lynn Calling from the Massachusetts Association for the Education of Young Children, J.D. Chesloff from the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, Peter Dolliber from the Alliance of the Massachusetts YMCAs, and Winnie Hagan from the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. This group was also supported by Ola Friday, Jay Swanson, and myself. So the full committee decided on the priority areas in which they wanted to have in terms of looking for additional membership. So they literally did look around the table at who is at the committee, and then they decided that they wanted to focus on expertise and leadership in the early childhood education field, multilingual capabilities, diversity, field experience, early childhood education experience, and early childhood education setting type. So the council and the membership working group were mindful of adding new members. Sorry. Sorry. They just wanted to be mindful of adding new members that had the experience and expertise in early education and out of school time. They were mindful of the different setting types and age groups of children represented by the council, and they were also mindful of the diversity in a broad form as well as the language or multi-language capabilities of council members. So this is just a little bit about our process and how we got to our recommendations for you here today. So all members, all current members of the EEC Workforce Council were given the opportunity to nominate candidates. We received 16 candidates for review. The working group committee decided that we didn't have enough information on each of those 16 candidates. So a survey was developed and sent to all candidates to capture some additional information and similar information aligned to the priority areas that were identified. There is a list of these survey questions in the appendix of the presentation. We received 13 candidate profiles back out of the 16 for review. The membership working group met to determine their process for reviewing and selecting candidates, and they used a standard rating rubric and criteria to score each of the candidates, and we are bringing 8 candidates to you for recommendation. So the candidates that the membership working group of the EEC Workforce Council are bringing for recommendation to you include Ardith Weeworker, CEO of Massachusetts After School Partnership, Clarence Little, retired administrator from Grove Hall Child Development and EPS coach, Jerry Robinson, retired Vice President of Early Childhood Initiatives at Boston Children's Museum, Jelaine Flanders, former public school principal from Framingham Public Schools, Lauren Kennedy, co-founder of Neighborhood Villages, Michael Taylor, president of Urban College, Sayun Lee, education policy consultant, and Valora Washington, CEO for the Council for Professional Recognition. So that's what I have for you, unless you have questions for me.
Joni and then Joan.
So I appreciate your willingness to be so inclusive and talk to me and a lot of other people. And I highly respect the recommended candidates. I mean, each one has a field of knowledge and expertise. I still think we have some gaps in this, and especially after the conversation we just had about the PEG and the 2 areas of expertise around early childhood mental health and social emotional development, as well as special ed and inclusion. I just don't think the body of folks are sufficient unless there's expertise that I don't know of. But I don't know if that has been addressed, and I think when we talk about rolling out our professional development and core knowledge and all the other initiatives, that those 2 pieces keep on coming up time and time and time again, particularly as it relates to community-based programs and their lack of expertise in that area. I would have liked to see some other people who balance that piece.
Thank you.
Yeah, so duly noted, Joni, and these were parts of the conversation that we had with the council for certain. I think the process of bringing forward candidates was an open one, and so we were left with who essentially, volunteered and wanted to sign up to be nominated, to be considered for nomination. Do know that the membership is on a 3-year cycle, so we will revisit the membership every year. So certainly there will be opportunities in the future to consider the membership moving forward as well.
And to also consider priorities that might not have been addressed initially.
My comment is just a very minor correction on 4. Jill Flanders is out of the South Hadley Public Schools.
Oh, thank you.
I think their greatest challenge is going to be in numbers and getting things done, right? It's a very, very large group, and I think where EEC could play a role would be to try to really channel the existing strategic work of the agency so that we're not adding to the plate, but we're using this group as a mechanism by which to collaborate and to drive further momentum, energy, costing models, whatever it is. There's a lot of talent among the 32. I think there could be some subgroups that could line up with threads of strands of the work in EEC. But I think the key is going to be to try to get it to a really mutually beneficial place and not simply have recommendations that are going to add to the plate at EEC, but rather actually drive some of the existing work. And I think we're all committed. These are great folks. I hope that I know we're all committed in principle to all of this work, and however we as the board can help with this additional body and leveraging it, absolutely. But that will be certainly both the challenge and the opportunity, because there's a lot of folks here who could help with driving the work.
Nani, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you see the Workforce Council, what is the relationship between the Workforce Council, the Workforce Committee, the board?
Yeah, well, I think
and the advisory board of EEC. Those 4 pieces.
This was the March discussion, right, at the Workforce Committee, and I guess I'm one person. I can tell you how I certainly think of it and how it may be the way to start to think about it. The agency and the board's Workforce Committee are on the ground to some degree, thinking about the work and the strategic work of the agency, period, right? The advisory council, in my view, in my experience, has been a great place to both vet proposals and discuss emerging work and directional changes, and also as a mechanism to message things through to the field. I could imagine, and I am again one person, I think this Workforce Council could be to some degree that same channel in terms of messaging and awareness raising, but I also see that group as a group, at least if broken out into subgroups, as potentially quite tightly connected to the board's Workforce Committee, or to serve in other such subcommittee roles to the agency in the analog scenario. In other words, we have fiscal and workforce. It could be that there's a special project or topic that we are not necessarily currently organized around, but could strike an ad hoc committee that includes some of these folks too. I'm just thinking aloud, but I think that is precisely the thinking that we all need to do collectively to be sure this is an opportunity for increased capacity and momentum.
Okay. And when we talk to the new commissioner candidates, so it would be interesting to see how they feel about all this.
Right.
How creative they are.
Right. I also had the idea that I think logistically it will be important for the agency staff and leaders in particular the leaders to try to do truly practically some of the scheduling adjacent. In other words, I do think that the danger would be we meet once a month, workforce committee meets once a month, workforce council and the advisory. If you have 4 monthly meetings that are all often focused on workforce and program quality, now you're into getting organized for meetings. And so I think we also want to help and endorse the idea of trying to streamline. And no harm in some joint meetings also, I think, at least at the subgroup level of this group with 1 or 2 of the other 2 committees that we're talking about.
The other thing that I think that would be really important is the communication lines.
Absolutely.
Who's communicating with who and who. How are we going to be sure that we all know what every group is talking
That's
about
right.
so that we are not reproducing the same efforts
That's
in
right.
4 different places?
Absolutely, no question. And that's where I hope that EEC and its leadership can be in the driver's seat in that regard. We are all in service of the goal and the work of the agency, certainly. Yeah. Well, why don't I make the motion? I move that the Board of Early Education and Care hereby approves, pursuant to Section 79 of Chapter 154 of the Acts of 2018, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts FY19 state budget, the membership working group's recommendation for additional members to the EEC Workforce Council. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Abstain.
Opposed? 1 abstained, 1 opposed. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That concludes our meeting for today. Thank you all, and we'll certainly keep in touch on all fronts. Take care.